Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for tuning in to the second of four of our August courses on population and climate change. Really happy to have you all here, and I'm looking forward to another great session. So last week we talked about population and climate change, and we looked at, in particular, like climate vulnerability and the capacity for certain populations that are growing very quickly amidst low income settings and lack of access to resources to readily adapt to climate impacts that are being felt disproportionately. And so that was a good segue into today's discussion, which is looking at climate justice. And we're going to get way into that during our presentation. But just before we start, in case there's anyone who is new here, this is a presentation that's being put on by Population Connection. And Population Connection is a US-based nonprofit organization that advocates for increased US funding for family planning programs internationally. And in addition to a lot of the advocacy work we do, we are also very invested in education and outreach about the connections between global population growth, access to healthcare, and environmental sustainability. So as Natalie mentioned, I am the communications manager here at Population Connection, and I'm going to be leading us through the discussion. So I think I'm going to be speaking for hopefully about 15 to 20 minutes, maybe slightly longer, but after that, we're going to open it up for discussion. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to chat them in the chat box, and we're going to get to as many of them as possible. And I think that because climate justice is such an interesting concept, and there are so many different facets to it, I'm really looking forward to some engaging discussion. Okay, so really quickly, I just wanted to take a minute to review our presentation last time. So as we were talking about before, we looked at the implications for population growth and climate change in various contexts. And some of the arguments that we ultimately made was that population growth is one very important contributor to climate change, and it also increases climate vulnerability throughout the world. So the fact that the world population is growing and will continue to grow at least until 2050 and likely until 2100 has substantial implications for environmental degradation and CO2 emissions, but also for increasing climate vulnerability for the vast majority of the world population that is low income and that will feel the effects of climate change the most severely, despite contributing the least amount to climate change in terms of CO2 emissions, which incidentally is one of the major principles behind climate justice. But so some of the fastest growing regions are also, again, the most vulnerable to climate change. And so in this context, again, population growth means that more people are going to be exposed to climate impacts who lack the resources necessary to readily adapt and recover. And high fertility rates, as we kind of talked about near the end, and we're going to get into this actually more in the fourth session, actually result from high rates of unintended pregnancies and a lack of access to quality reproductive health care services, including things like contraceptives and family planning. And so investment in comprehensive reproductive health care actually foster sustainable development initiatives and reduce climate impacts around the world. Okay, so climate justice, emanating from this discussion, and again, I think that the population and climate change discussion was a really good segue into looking at some of the intricacies in the population and climate change discussion with regards to justice and equity. So I'm going to institute my first poll here. So if you haven't done one of these before, it's very easy and straightforward. I'm just going to ask you a question and you can answer right on your screen. So have you heard and are familiar with the term climate justice? Have you heard of? Oh, I guess everybody's answered. So everybody's heard of climate justice. That's fantastic. So the answer was 100% yes. And so climate justice is a term that's used to describe climate change as a multifaceted issue with many different political, economic, and social relevancies. So the term actually conceptualizes climate change and climate impacts as an ethical and political issue, rather than one that's just purely environmental or physical in nature. So climate justice actually speaks to the fact that the effects of climate change disproportionately impact some of the most marginalized populations, and highlights the contradictions in that, embedded in that fact, right? That populations that are the least culpable for the consumption of fossil fuels and the production of greenhouse gas emissions, which cause climate change, will nevertheless experience its most severe effects. And this is and should be understood as a massive humanitarian problem. This is a really large scale human rights injustice around the world that we're seeing. So in solving climate change, while it's obviously very complex and there are many different approaches to it, and what climate justice is asks us to look at climate change as in terms and solutions in terms of grassroots efforts, right? And the need for it to be inclusive, right? So it should identify and actually work to dismantle systems of oppression and structural inequalities that have not only put innocent people in really grave danger with regards to climate change, but that have in many ways caused large scale ecological collapse, right? So this is a movement, again, that's calling on us to really re-envision the future of this planet in terms that are socially, economically, and environmentally sustainable, which of course would require some pretty substantial shifts in production practices and economic structures and the way that we trade and so on, but also within ourselves, right? So really looking deeper at our relationship with the natural environment, which surrounds us and sustains us, and working to construct new realities that work with rather than against natural systems, which are incredibly complex and from which we have a lot to learn. So throughout this class, as we're going to be talking about some of the connections, again, between population growth and climate change, one recurring theme is the issue of inequality. So as we continue today to talk about the concepts of climate justice, social inequities, systemic oppression, and environmental racism, one argument that I think I'd like to put forth is that rapid population growth in regions that are already very vulnerable to socially and environmentally should be included as an issue of climate injustice. The fact that there is a clear correlation between high fertility rates and poverty, and the fact that high fertility rates result from an unmet need for contraceptives and the inability of women to access comprehensive reproductive health care is a human rights violation. Access to quality reproductive care and family planning is considered an international human right. And so again, rapid population growth in low-income regions actually prevents sustainable development, as we were talking about last time, and further institutionalizes poverty. And that, coupled with the imminent threats posed by climate change and the fact that rapid population growth is increasing the strain in localized settings on both natural resources and social systems, is of grave concern, not only environmentally, but also, again, from human rights perspectives. Okay, and so I think that this is a good course. I think that the course on climate justice this week is a really good segue from last week, where we were talking about the links between population growth and climate change, and where we were really highlighting the concept of climate vulnerability, which looks at the ability of a country to adapt to and respond to the effects of climate change. And so the World Bank and the IPCC have actually created what's called the Climate Vulnerability Index, which ranks 193 countries based on various factors at the country level, like physical impacts, overall sensitivity, and things that are measured by looking at things like poverty rates, access to quality healthcare, education, and so on. And the ability to adapt is also a measure of the strength and stability of a country's institutions, the economy, government structure, and so on. And as we were talking about last week, we looked a lot into Bangladesh, right? Bangladesh was incurring massive flooding and still is. And they're incredibly vulnerable to climate change, in part because of their geographic location and also because of the really high population density that encompasses the region. So Bangladesh actually on the climate index ranks 7th out of 193 countries. And this is, again, looking at the ability for the country to actually adapt and respond to climate change in sort of social terms, but also the physical impacts that geographically the region is supposed to incur. And so the world's population is projected to increase by 2 billion people in the next 30 years. So that's from 7.7 billion now to 9.7 in 2050. And the population of sub-Saharan Africa in particular is expected to double by 2050, which would result in a 99% increase from today's levels. So the UN population prospects for 2019 actually show that 9 countries will account for more than half of the projected growth between now and 2050. These countries include India, Nigeria, Pakistan, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Ethiopia, the United Republic of Tanzania, Indonesia, Egypt, and the United States of America, and that's in descending order. And so as we're looking at and kind of conceptualizing climate justice, it's again important to remember where the populations around the world are growing the fastest and what implications that will have in terms of climate change. Also, just again, kind of a brief review, the warming projections with regards to climate change are pretty stark and pretty severe. So without any substantial mitigation, the warming that's projected to occur by 2100 will essentially make the planet uninhabitable, at least historically as we've known it to be true. And this sort of, and the implications for that in social terms are that there is going to be mass inequality, and people are going to be feeling the effects of climate change at completely different levels throughout the world, based primarily on things like socioeconomic status, the access to resources, governmental structure, and in some cases, race. And so as we talked about last time, there are some really important connections between population growth rates, economic status, and climate vulnerability throughout the world. So remember, the 47 least developed countries are also the fastest growing and face some of the most threatening and potentially devastating climate impacts in both the short and the long term. So 9 out of the 10 most climate vulnerable countries are in sub-Saharan Africa. And Africa, again, as we were talking about before, is expected to experience large-scale population growth. It's the fastest growing place in the entire world. Africa as a whole is likely going to add another 1 billion people just by 2050. And so as we're kind of working through this, and as we sort of develop the framework here for looking at things through a climate justice lens, we need to understand like what all of this means, right? And first, I want to note that, you know, while the global population is continuing to age, and as we were talking about, the global growth rates of the human population are much lower and will sort of contribute to lower growth rates into the future, the global population will continue to expand to levels already projected in 2019, even if drastic changes are made today. And that's because of what's called population momentum, which refers to the age structures of different countries. And in this case, it means that Africa, for example, has so many women of childbearing age that even if most decided right now to have fewer babies or no babies at all, the population would keep expanding. So for example, Uganda is about the same size as Michigan. It's right there, see it? But it has close to 46 million people, which means that its population is more than 4.5 times that of Michigan. So under 75% of Ugandans are actually under the age of 30, which means that population momentum will continue to play a significant role in terms of the country's demographics into the future. The population of Uganda is expected to reach 100 million by 2050 and 167 million people by the end of the century. And again, the fact that the world's poorest populations are growing the fastest presents real problems in terms of climate justice and vulnerability. And so climate vulnerability in Uganda has a lot to do with present and future population growth. So for one, 40% of the country actually lives in extreme poverty, earning less than $1.90 per day. Also, over 75% of the country is under the age of 30, which means that future population growth is almost certain no matter what. This is because Uganda has maintained an annual growth rate of around 3% for the past few decades, indicating that the population will double every 23 years. So right now, Uganda is currently adding close to 1 million people per year. And also the vast majority of Ugandans, over 70%, are small scale or subsistence farmers who depend on rain-fed agriculture to survive. So global warming is going to make food production incredibly more difficult, if not impossible, for many different populations. And this warming that's projected to occur is going to intensify precipitation patterns and exacerbate droughts and flooding, all to the detriment of crop yields. So the country's meager contribution to global CO2 emissions is actually really disproportionate to the climate impacts it faces. Uganda, because of its low economic status and geographic location, ranks among the world's most vulnerable to climate change, but it also ranks amongst the least prepared countries with regards to addressing climate change. So together, things like large-scale deforestation, soil erosion, and climate impacts actually threaten to undermine the significant improvements that poverty eradication has seen throughout the past several decades. So again, while the country has worked very hard on developing and increasing its economic status and increasing access to resources and social services and things like that, climate change is now inhibiting that progress and further institutionalizing poverty. So this is a really big problem for a lot of different countries throughout the world that are in the process of developing, because they are facing, like, at once the very urgent need to develop economically speaking and to transform their economies to be more advantageous monetarily speaking, but they're unable to do so because of the climate restrictions that are prohibiting food production or agriculture exports or anything that would help them sort of transcend that socioeconomic state. And so in very many ways, population and environment issues have acute relevance to climate justice. And as we've been talking about, the effects of climate change will be the most severe for the least culpable, for those who are the least culpable for anthropogenic emissions which cause climate change. And so in recognizing the disproportionate impact that marginalized populations feel regarding climate change, one other key aspect of the concept of climate justice is that there are large and overarching systems of oppression and exclusion that have resulted from extensive histories of colonization and neocolonialism and social exclusion and marginalization that contribute to this increased vulnerability and to other environmental injustices. And this makes sense, like in a sort of baseline, straightforward way. The fact that low-income populations like in Bangladesh and Uganda are more vulnerable to climate change has in part to do with the fact that there are high poverty rates in the country. There's low economic status. There's a lack of available resources overall, because in a straightforward sense, the countries are less affluent than in comparison to other countries. But climate justice is asking us to take a step further and to look at not only the present day sort of economic status of a country, but also to recognize and sort of incorporate the very extensive and impactful histories of colonialism and exploitation that have contributed to this present status and worsened climate vulnerability. And of course, this is happening all over the world. And as the world continues to warm, more and more people are going to be exposed to climate impacts, and more places will become uninhabitable. And so on the front lines of these climatic shifts and these increases in global temperatures are some of the world's most marginalized populations. And the New York Times actually just published a piece looking at the disproportionate impact that warming temperatures is already having in various places throughout the world. And this is I took this map here from that article, and it's fantastic if you haven't read it. They go through and look at 4 or 5 different countries and states throughout the world, and they look at the impact that particular people and families are having with regards to excessive heat. But the New York Times article has put forth information saying that for the past 60 years, every 10 years has been hotter than the last, and 2020 is no different. So temperatures have actually reached 100 degrees in the Arctic Circle this June. And there's, examples of like record-breaking temperatures all over the world. But in Baghdad this July, for example, temperatures actually reached 125 degrees Fahrenheit, which again broke a lot of records. And remember, as we talked about last week, temperatures in the Sahel region are rising 1.5 times faster than the global average. And future projections show an increase of 3 to 5 degrees Celsius above 2013 levels by 2050 alone. And further warming could reach 8 degrees Celsius above the same levels by 2100. And so these increases are not only life-threatening, but they will likely make this region just uninhabitable. And this is a region where the population is growing the fastest in the entire world. So again, presenting really major humanitarian issues. So the New York Times, as I was saying, they chose about 4 or 5 different locations to interview people who are already enduring the effects of climate-related heat waves. Some, like a man named Hasib Hotak, who's a homeless Afghan refugee living in Athens, Greece. He regularly sleeps on a rooftop because it's too hot to sleep inside. Another example is in Houston, which I just learned is one of the United States' fastest warming cities, excuse me. And low-income families who are often working in labor-intensive jobs such as construction or in some cases housekeeping struggle to survive in that heat. Average temperatures in Houston alone have risen more than 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit since 1970. And in mid-July, the city's heat index peaked above 110 degrees. And it essentially offered a glimpse into the future, right? If emissions of greenhouse gases continue to rise at their current pace, Houston could see 109 days each year on average where the heat index tops 100 degrees. And this presents real problems in terms of environmental health and for people who are working labor-intensive jobs outside. And so while the United States is considered a sort of affluent nation for which climate injustice issues seemingly don't apply, right? Because we're some of the biggest contributors to climate change, but do not rank very high in terms of vulnerability. We are not at all actually immune to, can you guys see that? Hopefully not. We're not immune to the sort of structural inequities that are increasing climate vulnerability. In fact, in some of the more localized contexts, the environmental justice movement has shed light on some of the most profound and often hidden inequalities of our time. So the environmental justice movement actually started around 1978 in the United States when the governor of Warren County, North Carolina, okayed the dumping of over 30,000 gallons of PCB, which is a toxic chemical, in a community that was 75% minority and one of the state's poorest. So the movement gained political clout in the 1980s and has continued into the present with the intent of focusing again on the structural inequities that contribute to things like one's propensity to experience an increased risk of exposure to toxic chemicals, to pollution, and to other environmental toxins, or to the likelihood that your community will be located next to an extractive or highly polluting facility. And this picture here is just was taken in Warren County as protesters were trying to stop and block dump trucks of contaminated soil from coming into their community. Okay, I think I have another poll for you guys. Okay, here's a true or false question. This is, all of you are familiar with climate justice, it might be fairly straightforward, but it's asking true or false. All Americans face the same burden of exposure to particulate matter since we're all breathing the same air. All right, answers coming in 100% so far, slanting one way. All right, we're at about 98%. So I'm just gonna end it. Oh, one person got it wrong, but most of you got it right. So false, we're not all, breathing the same air. And this is a major principle of environmental justice and climate justice as well, essentially. So both of them seek to understand the intersections between environmental inequities and social injustices. And so in this work, it's really important to understand the differences in experience between individuals, groups, states, and countries as they relate to socio-political histories and systems of oppression, which are all interconnected. So for example, if we want to learn about poverty from an environmental justice perspective, we shouldn't just research where incomes are lowest, right? Rather, we should seek to understand the root of economic inequality, which are certainly delineated according to race and histories of structural oppression and exclusion and so forth. And further, it's not accurate only to look at environmental issues and environmental damage or climate change. We must also look at where it's happening, who will be most affected, and why. We need to look at how histories of imperialism and hegemonic rule have influenced a country's ability to develop and adapt to environmental change. And in the US especially, understanding environmental justice means making the very clear connections between class, race, and gender inequities that have exacerbated environmental impacts and caused large-scale ecological decline. So in other words, environmental justice is not just a singular issue, but it's in fact rather a complex and interconnected web, so to speak, of social, political, and economic structures that influence climate change and ultimately the way that people interact with the environment. And so in creating solutions to things like climate change and to environmental conservation, the voices of those who are most affected by environmental damage must be included. So environmental justice has basic principles, and essentially it's arguing that there are, particular communities as delineated by things like race and socioeconomic status are more at risk for environmental harms that create health disparities. And so it looks at the sort of social constructs of race and class that can amplify the effects of exposures and health outcomes for populations in the United States. And so it recognizes that health disparities by race exist in part because of the well-documented tendency to build extractive and polluting facilities in Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities. And environmental health can also be measured by like social determinants, of course, as you would ordinarily do that, like by average income, for example, but also by environmental stressors like air pollution and lead, which lead to things like heart disease, cognitive impairments, and so on. And here I just want to give a local example of environmental injustice, environmental racism. So this is in Barrio Logan, San Diego. This is a historically almost entirely Hispanic community, and they have sort of developed right near the shipyard as a consequence of redlining and social exclusion and histories of colonization and so forth. But it's actually a very sort of vibrant and highly political community. So much so that they have recognized and worked to address these environmental injustices in their neighborhoods. So they're located right next to a large shipping facility that does not normally pay attention to environmental regulations or rules when constructing new facilities and so forth. So they've called attention to this in terms of environmental racism. And their argument is to look at pollution rates in San Diego. So this is San Diego County, for those of you who aren't from here. And as you can see, and unfortunately you can't see all of the city names very well, but Barrio Logan is located in an area where the pollution is the greatest in comparison to anywhere else in the county. And if you look and compare that to the racial composition in San Diego, you'll see that Hispanic communities are the most at risk in comparison to white communities for decreased air quality and so forth. And in fact, asthma rates in Barrio Logan are astronomically higher than they are anywhere else in the county. And the sort of argument put forth by environmental justice movements is that these extractive facilities or polluting industries would locate in a place that's more affluent or whiter, like La Jolla, for example, which is up here in the north. You can see my cursor, the very, very wealthy, almost entirely white community. And the argument again is that an extractive facility like that would never be located there. And it's true. And so unfortunately, there are many different examples of environmental injustices in the United States. And I could just go on and on about this. And I realize we're kind of getting to the end of our time here. But a recent study just published in 2019 actually found that Black Americans experienced 56% more air pollution than others relative to how much they produce. And conversely, white Americans actually experience 17% less pollution than others relative to what they produce. So in essence, white Americans produce much more pollution but breathe healthier air than Black Americans who produce less pollution and breathe dirtier air. And we're really starting to see this kind of play out with regards to the impact that COVID-19 has had on particular communities. So this is just a local example of the COVID-19 deaths as a share of certain social indicators, like poverty limits, like access to healthcare, diabetes rates, food access, cancer rates, and so on. And this has direct ties also to low-income socioeconomic statuses and rates. So if you look, and as we're all pretty aware, again, these inequalities are playing out in terms of understanding the effect that COVID-19 has had on particular communities by race and by income. So in an analysis done by USA Today, in the poorest neighborhoods where the median household income is less than $35,000, the COVID-19 infection rate was twice as high as in the nation's wealthiest zip codes with incomes of more than $75,000 a year. And so again, environmental justice just very simply is asking us to look at the underlying causes of these disparities, not just the fact that there are these disparities. And this is going to have a lot to do, again, with things like social exclusion and systems of oppression, which intersect in very many complex ways. And so again, along with, environmental justice, along with climate justice, seeks to understand the effects of environmental degradation in social terms. And as environmentalists, then, we need to work to better understand the disparities that exist and have always existed regarding health, socioeconomic status, race, gender, and so on, that really exacerbate the effects of environmental harm and put particular populations at risk, to the detriment ultimately of healthy ecosystems and a thriving planet. Like, nobody's benefiting from these systems that have been put in place. Ultimately, it's contributing to large-scale ecological devastation that is going to affect everyone. And so as we start to look at solutions and find ways forward, climate justice asks us to re-envision, again, what it means to be an environmentalist. In the US, the term is contentious in some ways and has been entangled in cultural identities that have been deliberately exclusive to marginalized and historically oppressed populations. So the Native American populations in the United States are well aware of this contradiction and have a long history of fighting for environmental justice and to protect their lands from corporate invasion, extraction, and so forth. And so, for example, in fighting against the construction or continued use of large oil pipelines like the Keystone XL and the Dakota Access Pipeline, Native American groups have stood up against powerful corporate interests and highlighted the futility, ultimately, of fueling dependence on fossil fuels while potentially poisoning vital water systems. And they've called for a better, more inclusive and holistic approach to human-environment interactions, speaking to the very real importance of protecting nature as a way of protecting ourselves. And so the environmental and climate justice movements very necessarily are about bringing power back to the people and back to the most marginalized populations. Historically led by populations most affected by corporate-led environmental devastation and extractive facilities and so forth, the environmental justice movement seeks actually to dismantle the structural inequities that have pervaded social, political, and economic systems in the United States and ultimately around the world. So Native Americans in particular have also called into question the entire foundation of modern environmentalist movements in the United States, arguing that the idea of something like wilderness or nature as being separate from us as humans is an idea that has been constructed and adopted by Western culture, which has sought to separate the two, rather than recognizing that human beings are very, much a part of nature and should work to find ways to work in accordance with it rather than against it, which is historically what kind of Western civilization has always found advantageous. And so as we finish up here, I think that it's important to kind of bring up the PHE approach to development that we highlighted in the last class, recognizing the sort of interconnections between various social and environmental indicators and working to address them in an integrated way rather than in a siloed sort of separate fashion. So remember, the PHE approach to developmental solutions means that we strive to sort of educate about the interconnected nature of environmental sustainability and public health. So if we look at the underlying issues surrounding human-induced environmental problems like habitat destruction or deforestation, they can be traced back to issues of poverty, marginalization, or lack of access to public health or economic alternatives or resources more broadly. And so by increasing access to things like public health, to family planning education, to economic opportunity, and to environmental education, we can then promote community-based environmental sustainability and conservation while also increasing the overall levels of health for humans, animals, and the environment. And again, this principle is very much based around the sort of realization, finally, that the health of humanity is very much dependent on the health of the planet. And so I think that we're going to start discussion soon, and I'd like to hear all of your thoughts about the kind of ways that we realize climate justice and social justice more broadly. But the basic principles in creating these solutions are that they must be rooted in principles of human rights and social justice. Addressing climate solutions without addressing inequity is futile, and it's also going to be ineffective. Also, addressing climate change necessarily means addressing systemic inequalities that contribute to marginalization and worsen impacts. So recognizing that the very same processes that contribute to marginalization and social inequities are also the ones that are driving these extractive forces and this dependence on fossil fuels that is ultimately contributing to climate change. And finally, climate justice means changing our relationship with other humans, animals, and the planet to facilitate a better, more equitable future. And we're going to get into this in a little bit more detail next week as we talk about the potential solutions for zoonotic diseases and pandemics like COVID-19. But again, kind of re-envisioning what it might look like, what a future might look like where we can actually work in accordance with nature rather than against it and promote social equity and environmental sustainability. And of course, achieving this is a pretty hefty feat. And I think that it should be really looked at as a long-term process and something that we're ready to be in for the long haul. And these types of realizations sort of challenge the very foundation of our society and our world economy as we've known them. And as hard as it is to talk about these issues, it's even more difficult to put it into practice. And in the United States, I think we've seen some examples of policy initiatives that have aimed at sort of addressing these inequities, things like the Green New Deal and the new Climate Action Plan that was just recently unveiled. And that works specifically to benefit low-income communities, which means looking at things like disparities in education, housing, access to resources, and so on, and working to protect communities already at risk for environmental injustices. And globally, we could go into more detail on this, but the Sustainable Development Goals that have been set forth by the United Nations and aim to facilitate sustainable development throughout the world have also been used as a benchmark for countries to realize both environmental and social goals towards a more equitable future. So with that, I'm going to end it. We can open it up for discussion. Please let me know if you have any questions, and thank you.
All right, thanks, Hannah. Yeah, we definitely have some questions, so we'll get started with them. The first one is, do you see examples of places around the world where, due to climate change, people are literally moving away because those places are no longer habitable to human life?
Yes, definitely. Climate migration is something that is an increasingly pervasive issue throughout the world. I think a recent 2018 World Bank report projected that 143 million people are going to be forcefully displaced, meaning that they're going to have to move as a consequence of things like rising sea levels or inarable land or things like that. So that is another really interesting part of sort of population and climate change issues, is that of migration. And excuse me. And of course, it's really hard to measure, right? Because they will depend on sorry, one second. They're going to depend very heavily on the policy initiatives that we enact or don't. But certainly it's already causing large scale migration throughout India and other places. I think you're muted.
Thanks, Hannah. There's an article in the chat for everyone to read more about that specific question. All right, this is a really common question that we get. It is, won't CO2 emissions increase as a country becomes richer and has fewer births? Won't those countries become consumers like more affluent countries?
So yeah, I mean, that's one of the major issues with regards to population growth and climate change, is recognizing that the economic structures that we've put in place globally do contribute to environmental degradation. And as countries start to develop and industrialize, that historically has always meant large scale like pollution and extraction. So it's a major concern, of course, but what we need to kind of be focusing on is the development of alternative economies and ways to interact with the environment that are more sustainable and that facilitate both climate solutions and a more equitable future socially. I don't think that it has to be that way. It's just historically what's happened. And that's also, we don't want to ever say that, you know, these places shouldn't industrialize or shouldn't develop. Of course, everybody deserves the ability to access resources and increase their standards of living and live a comfortable life. And, you know, that should be the pursuit that everybody has an opportunity for. And also there are like a variety of social and environmental benefits to this as well, including ultimately reductions in fertility rates. But again, this is just a different sort of situation now as we're considering these very imminent threats posed by climate change. And in addition to that, I think that the major focus in terms of offsetting CO2 emissions should be the production and consumption of fossil fuels, which is most prevalent in the most affluent countries, and amongst multinational corporations. So if we're looking to offset CO2 emissions, then that should be our focus. But population is one other very important indicator.
Absolutely. All right, here's another one. There are lots of reasons to promote access to reproductive health care and contraception, but it's less clear how doing this in areas of greatest fertility, which, as you talked about, Hannah, are also most vulnerable to climate change, will help much with climate change and environmental justice in general. So, the connections aren't completely clear between access to contraceptives and helping to mitigate these issues.
So at the beginning of the question, you said access to contraceptives in low-income regions. Is that what you said?
Yeah, access to contraceptives in countries with unmet need, which are lower income and also most vulnerable to climate change.
Yeah.
How does that contribute to climate mitigation?
Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, that's something that we talked about a little bit during our last class, and something that we're really going to focus and hone in on the fourth class, which is looking at solutions through reproductive health and the ability for family planning in the short and long term to kind of offset climate impacts and to mitigate climate change in general. And I think increasing access to family planning services, because it's an integrated solution that is somewhat long-term in terms of seeing effects, the assumption is that it won't have an immediate impact. And in many ways, that is sort of true. I mean, I think that increasing access to family planning and meeting the unmet need for family planning services has immediate social benefits, but the environmental benefits in the immediate are less extreme than later down the road. So because access to family planning is something that people gain and then pass on to future generations, it's something that is developmentally and generationally going to compound over time. And the reduction in fertility rates over by 2100, for example, if everybody were to increase access to family planning right now, would be substantial. Both in terms of increasing the ability for populations that are most at risk to adapt to climate change, because they have fewer kids, there's higher education levels, there's increases in economic status, and family planning has a variety of social benefits as well. But also in terms of offsetting emissions in the long term. If that makes sense.
Absolutely. Okay. Yeah, if anyone needs more clarification, you can put in the chat. If we have time, Hannah can discuss it. And remember, you can always email us at engage@popconnect.org if you'd like follow up to any of these, if there's questions we don't get to, or if more things come up, and Hannah or someone else here will respond to you as quickly as they can. So we have time for one or two more. This was one that is also kind of commonly asked, is does population pressure increase division and divisiveness?
Does it increase conflict?
Yeah, we could say conflict.
Yeah. Well, population pressures, I'm assuming the term refers to kind of rapid population growth in low income settings. And yeah, I think that there are a variety of social, environmental, implications for rapid population growth. I think this is something that is going to be compounded by climate change, because as areas become more inhabitable and as land and access to arable land and access to potable water and things become more limited, the incidents that people are going to have to move as a consequence of climate related impacts is going to be higher. The incidence of conflict is going to be higher. And of course, this is a very complex issue and something that has a really long lineage with regards to colonization and the construction of borders and so on. I think it's definitely going to increase the incidence and propensity for conflict.
All right, last question. Let's pick one more. let's see. So this is, again, another common question that we see is, how does the death rate affect the population growth rate? Won't death rates go up when there's no food, for example?
Yes, and so that's something that's kind of interesting because future population projections are often done by economists, and they're not, they don't include the sort of forecasting for ecological collapse or for projected climate impacts or things like that. Again, I think because it's just extremely hard to measure. I think that one person who was on the call last week is actually working on something to fix that. But right now, I think population projections just include are used based on historical data and projections for the future based on like access to resources and assumptions about increases in family planning and access to education and the status of women and so forth. But I think that, yeah, death rates are definitely going to increase substantially as a consequence of climate impacts. They're just not included in population projection models. The fact that climate change is increasing the unpredictability of weather patterns and extreme weather events and precipitation and drought, I think makes it really, really difficult to measure what the impact of that will be in terms of death rates overall.
That makes sense. So, all right, I think we're pretty close to the end of our time, so we'll wrap it up there. Again, if you look in the chat, someone chatted in the Engage email. So once again, definitely feel free to keep passing questions along there as you think of them. Let's see, more housekeeping. So thank you again for joining us. Again, if you haven't registered for the rest of the sessions, we'd love to have you here. Obviously, this is a series, so they're building on each other, and Hannah will be building upon what you learned here and hopefully answering some of the questions that came up in more depth, going forward. So definitely go to our website. It's on the homepage if you scroll down. That's the easiest way to get to the landing page with the sign up sheet. If you, for some reason, have issues, you can also email us and we can take care of it for you. And aside from that, I think we're done for today. Hannah, if there's anything I'm forgetting, you can let me know, but thank you for the presentation. And again, thank you everyone for joining us. And we hope you found it interesting and informative and definitely timely.
Yeah. Thank you all for attending. And I look forward to hearing from you via email or seeing you next week.
Right.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.